Clarity, balance, and purpose strengthens a leader's resolve and ability to surf the waves of complexity. But many leaders are stressed and react by looking for immediate action instead of working with a larger vision, with clarity, with balance, and with purpose. Let's see what Fabrice Desmarescaux proposes, like solution. Fabrice Desmarescaux, is the author of The Art of Retreats, A Leader's Journey Towards Clarity, Balance, and Purpose. Fabrice works with CEOs and their teams to help them reach higher levels of performance and consciousness. So I cannot wait to hear Fabrice's interview. I also want to tell you that he works for McKinsey, and in particular, Aberkin. So Fabrice, welcome.
Hey, Katrina. Good to be here.
Yes. So we're at the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Katrina Burrus. And let's start this podcast with the first question. What personal challenge do you see CEOs and senior executives face today, Fabrice?
Well, I think there's probably three major challenges. The first one is the amount of pressure the CEOs and their leadership teams are under. That is clearly the first imperative to keep businesses going and growing.
So what's the consequences?
Well, the consequence of pressure is less time for oneself and probably feeling that the world sometimes is closing in on us because, there's so many things to do and so many priorities to attend to that we don't really have time to elevate ourselves and take some perspective.
Right. So what other challenge do they have?
Well, the second challenge, and that's consequence probably of the first one, is fragmentation. We live our lives as leaders in very small time increments, and we're always rushing from one place to another, from one meeting to another, from one priority to another. And the time that we have to allocate to anything is very short. And we rarely have time to take an issue, give it the time it needs, and go really in depth. And so the result of that is that we tend to remain fairly shallow without much bandwidth to dive deep into the issues that matter.
So in some ways they're under pressure to make a quick decision in a highly complex and changing environment, and they don't take the time to really think it out strategically, for example. Is that what you're saying? Yeah,
that's absolutely right. I mean, the image that I use sometimes is, this circus act where there's a guy that spins plates. And, he never gets all his plates in order because there's always one that threatens to fall. And so he needs to attend to it and give it another spin. And it never ends. You'd think, okay, when am I finally going to get all my plates, spinning perfectly? And the answer is never, because there's always a burning platform. There's always a fire to put out.
A crisis situation to attend to.
There's always a crisis, right?
Yeah.
The third challenge, Katrina, is the increasing complexity of the world. And that is something that a lot of leaders grapple with. Is the world is no longer simple. Now that sounds like a huge cliche, but it is true that it is very, very hard today to predict what are the consequences of our actions, because the linkages between what we do and the results are very, very hard to fathom. And that is something that is quite hard to contend with as a leader or as a leadership team, because we really live in a world of uncertainty given that complexity.
So the complexity is increasing. The need to rapidly make a decision is putting pressure, and the uncertainty of the market.
That's absolutely right. So we find leadership teams that we work with really in situations where it is really, really hard to elevate ourselves and take some perspective. How do we take the elevator or climb the stairs to a balcony where we can see the whole situation with clarity? That is very, very hard to realize.
So how do you help your clients?
Well, in many ways, but in particular, what I try to do when I work with my clients is to create a space where we progressively take the constraints away. So we take the constraints of pressure, we take the constraints of complexity, we take the constraints of fragmentation away, and we create a space where we're going to be calm, centered. We're going to be in stillness, sometimes in silence. And from that place of stillness and silence and calm and serenity comes more clarity. Mm-hmm. The challenge with that is, how do we find the time to do that, right? And I always encourage the clients I work with to create some pockets of time. It doesn't need to be very long, but pockets of time where they can really retreat, hence the title of the book, The Art of Retreats, where they can be alone in silence, in solitude, in stillness, and progressively achieve better clarity and better decision-making and stronger purpose to deal with the business that they're running or their situation.
So it's like coaching, where they have a space and time to step back and see the overall picture, to think out their decision-making process, to listen to themselves thinking, and maybe the coach or you, for example, you help them step back and see what's important.
Yes, that's right. I think there's many ways to do that. One is in a coaching session where I try to create a space for clients to find that place of calm and serenity. Clients can do it themselves. I don't have the monopoly of creating a safe space for my clients. I think anyone, any leader can create a space of calm and silence and stillness and solitude once in a while. And for that, you don't need to travel to Tibet or climb the mountain and go to the monastery or the nunnery to do that. You can do that in the comfort of your house. You can go to a cabin in the woods. You can go even to a coffee shop and sit in a coffee shop. You disconnect your phone. You have a blank sheet of paper in front of you and see what comes up. Maybe make a list of the issues, the most important issues that you want to think about, and try to go deeper, reject the ideology of busyness, of fragmentation, and just let the answers come to you in this, what I call this sacred space. So you don't need to retreat in a monastery for a month to do that.
Yes, you said your interest in learning about the Eastern spiritual traditions and integrating it with Western modern management. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's right. I'm laughing because this is pretty much the story of my life, right? So I was brought up in France, in Paris, as you can tell from my accent. So I spent the first 25 years of my life in Paris and then moved, but I've also spent the last 25 years in Asia. So approximately half of my life in the West, half of my life in the East. And since moving to Asia, I've studied the Asian spiritual traditions. I've studied yoga. I've studied Buddhism, both in the Theravada and the Tibetan tradition, practiced meditation, and I teach meditation and yoga. So that has given me a completely different perspective. And what I try to do in the work with my clients is actually to blend this Western, what we could call rationalism, Cartesianism, with Eastern spiritual traditions, which are much more focused on the being than the doing. And I think this marrying of doing and being that helps leaders become more contemplative and add a dimension of depth, perhaps, to their action. It's not all about EBITDA. It's not all about shareholder value. It's not all about achieving the KPIs, right? It's also about what is the meaning that you inject in your everyday work? How do you inspire your employees? What is the higher purpose that you're pursuing? And that, I think, we can achieve quite well when we blend the two perspectives.
So give us a concrete example where you helped a client, a marriage between the Western form and the Eastern form. You mentioned meditation, yoga. You mentioned going to the coffee shop with a white piece of paper to sit there and really think things out, and for enough time to have insights.
That's right. I'll give you a couple of examples. I think the first one is the art of being. I think most leaders, and look, I think I'm a victim of that occasionally in my own life as well. We fall prey to that ideology of busyness, and we need to be doing and doing and doing. And we think that the more we do, the more we achieve. So one of the perspectives that I offer to my clients is that of not doing. So sometimes in coaching sessions, we say, well, look, we're not going to do anything. We're just going to sit. I'm necessarily going to ask my clients to sit with me for an hour sitting in lotus, etc. That is not realistic. But let's take a few minutes at the beginning of a session and let's just sit there and notice what's happening. So a traditional mindfulness approach, if you want, let's see what comes up. Let's listen to the sounds. Let's observe the sensations in the body. Let's not rush into the conversation. Let's not rush again in problem solving. We do problem solving all day long. Let's give ourselves a breather. So that's one approach. And you would be surprised what comes out of just 5 or 10 minutes of sitting in stillness and silence. And I guide my clients through that. So that's one example.
So what kind of, just to be concrete, what kind of insights do they get from it? Can you have an example of clients and what their insights from that is?
Oh, yeah. Well, very often sitting in stillness and silence and focusing on the breath brings you into a state of presence where what seemed to be an insurmountable issue before suddenly becomes something that is not so important, or something that perhaps we can find a different way of resolving. So we gain perspective when we slow down and we just take the time to look at things. And particularly when we slow down, we breathe, we listen, we don't move. Suddenly, I think the hierarchy of issues, the hierarchy of priorities change. And we become much more relaxed about addressing the pressing issues we need to address. So that's one example.
So it sounds like you relativize the situations after a meditation or taking this time, and then you sort of listen. When you say you listen, probably have insights that come, intuitive insights that come to you. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, absolutely. And I think when we slow down and we find ourselves, more connecting with our own presence, with our own soul, I'm not afraid to use the word, right? Suddenly, I think our best qualities come to the surface. When we're pressed by issues, by complexity, by priorities, problems to solve, etc., very often there's a contraction that happens in us, right? We feel like we're assaulted by the world and we don't have space to breathe. We don't have space to think. And there's a form of contraction. We notice it in the body, right? A lot of leaders have very, very tense bodies, contraction in the shoulders, in the neck, right? And so offering that space to relax and release that tension suddenly lets our best qualities of courage, qualities of compassion, qualities of strength, qualities of patience come to the surface. And when we embody these qualities, suddenly, the issues that we need to solve, the situation, the business problems that we need to solve, suddenly we see with a very different light.
So you also mentioned that traditional management science doesn't really work with today's situation. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think it is more challenged. And actually, that's the second example I wanted to give you about how we work with clients. The traditional Western thinking in management is about predictability. We must be able to predict the future. And we do that through robust industrial processes. We do that through budgeting. We do that through strategies. And the whole ideology of Western management is that once we have created a plan and we've put a budget in front of it, we feel safe because we feel that we can predict the future, right? The numbers are here in front of us. We know exactly what is going to be our sales next year or profit next year. We can present that to our shareholders. The world is good. Okay, so that's perfect, except that it doesn't work anymore. Imagine how many hundreds of millions of hours finance teams spent on budgets for 2020 at the end of 2019. And these budgets were absolutely useless because COVID happened. And COVID is just one of many, many examples of unpredictable events that will affect businesses. So the ideology of predictability and of determinism, if I know the inputs I put in my business, then I can predict the output. That is completely outdated. It doesn't work anymore because for many problems that we have to look at, actually the solutions are not complicated, they're complex, right? I'm using a distinction that was created initially by David Snowden. We cannot really understand the relationship between inputs and outputs in a complex world. And so instead of falsely creating safety for ourselves by believing that we can predict the future, I think it's worth taking a little bit of time and say, well, you know what? Maybe I actually don't know. And that's an approach that we take from Zen Buddhism, right? This beginner approach. I look at a problem with a fresh perspective. Instead of believing that the recipes of the past will help me solve the future, I just sit here and I say, well, maybe actually I don't know. And when you finally accept that you don't know, then it's an entire new conversation that can take place. And so I encourage my clients and my leadership teams that I work with, instead of rushing into solution and problem solving, to take a moment and say, well, actually, maybe we don't know here. And there's no shame in admitting that we don't know, because most complex problems of the world, we actually don't know the solutions. We don't know how to resolve climate change. We don't know how to bring peace to the world or create a sustainable world, etc. There's many, many problems that we don't know. So let's not rush into solutions. Let's take time. Let's take time to retreat. Let's take time to admit that we don't know and potentially look at new solutions.
So instead of having a deterministic mindset where you push things through, then it's sort of like a more expectant receiving and opening up to new ideas. Can you comment on that?
That's absolutely right. If you start looking at a complex problem with a mindset that you must force a certain solution, you must force a certain framework. What did we do last year? You're always going to repeat the same mistakes. And that's why there's recurring problems that we are not able to solve, because particularly problems involving large systems, right? I used climate change. That's the archetypical complex problem that has so many actors involved and so many different parameters that the solution cannot be deterministic. So, but even in simpler business problems, like, for example, launching a new product that doesn't have a market yet, well, we can do all the market studies, the focus groups, etc. It is very, very hard to predict what the market response is going to be to a completely new product. And so instead of trying to force, predictions, market share, etc., taking small steps, small experiments. I don't like to call it pilots, but I prefer to call it probes, and testing how the system responds to our actions is a much more beneficial approach than trying to write 50 pages of forecasts and budgets, for example.
So really, really test out an idea and see how the market responds to it before.
Yes.
So it's really going a mindset from, let's say, determining a plan for the next 3 years and what's the budget and what's the desired revenue, to saying, okay, then let's test out, something, an idea, and see how it reacts, and then continue. But to always test out you're constantly in a closer relationship with the market, it seems, from what I understand you're saying.
Yes. And more importantly, we need to approach that with an attitude of humility, because in the face of complexity, no amount of science, no amount of expertise can help us devise the response to the system. So the only approach towards complexity is this Zen beginner's mind. And that is very difficult to achieve when we are constantly rushed to produce solutions, but it's quite easy to adopt when we give ourselves the luxury of time and perhaps creating a small retreat. So what I very often do with our clients and leadership teams in particular is, instead of a short workshop in a hotel business center, I say, let's go off-site. Let's take a little bit more time and let's go in nature. Let's go to a nice resort and leave the phones at the door and just spend time in connection with nature, in a place of stillness, of silence, of peace. And let's talk to each other. And you would be amazed, Katrina, how new perspectives arise from simply disconnecting from the busyness of daily life, disconnecting from our devices, which are the constant interrupters of our lives, and giving ourselves the time to be present to the issues that we're facing. This is, for many management teams, this is a game changer.
So you suggest to take these retreats, small retreats, to really quiet your mind and be open to more opportunities. When you say a short retreat, what does short mean?
I knew you were going to ask that.
Good.
Look, there's no prescription. I think an hour, 2 hours for people who don't have much time. And the reality is that most of the leaders we work with don't have a lot of time. I think taking an hour or two, going to a place, there's 4 components really, right? We must find silence and stillness. And so the prerequisite to finding silence is disconnecting the gadgets, disconnecting the phone, disconnecting the tablets, not bringing the laptop. And suddenly time opens up, right? When time opens up, when we're disconnected, because we're not under the constant rush of notifications and etc. The second dimension is solitude. So we go alone. The third dimension is the space has to be inspiring. So it will be different strokes for different folks, but some people like to be in nature. Others prefer urban settings, but it has to feel cozy and comfortable. And right, you walk into a space sometimes and you feel inspired, right? The vibes are good. And other spaces make you feel like constrained and constricted, etc. So choose a space that expands your heart, right? And lastly, I think it's a willingness to connect with your spirit. So we're not going into this place of retreat just to read a book, for example, but we want to get more connected to ourselves. And I think when these 4 prerequisites of silence, solitude, space, and spirit are present, I think, even 1 hour, and it doesn't have to be at the top of the mountain, right? It could just be, as I said, right, in a hotel lounge or a coffee shop, or even at home, if we have a nice room where we feel cozy, that is sufficient.
Wonderful.
Of course,
suggestion.
If you have more time,
yes.
If you can take a weekend, there's also a lot of benefits of having a night included in the retreat, because the space at night usually brings us much more stillness, and new insights usually come from doing a retreat that includes an overnight stay, but it's not a prerequisite.
Very interesting. Unfortunately, we're coming to our end of the podcast, and I want to ask you, where can people get a hold of you?
Well, they can contact me at fabrice@desmarescaux.com or through McKinsey on Aberkin.
Good. I'll have these on the show notes, of course. Thank you very much, Fabrice. I like you have both the yin and the yang in your process.
That's right. Thank you, Katrina. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. You can subscribe to all future podcasts at excellentexecutivecoaching.com. Join us each Wednesday to learn more about the latest trends in leadership techniques and bring your coaching to the next level. To learn more about Dr. Burrus' CEO Mastermind, use the contact form at excellentexecutivecoaching.com.